Good morning and welcome to our dear colleagues and customers in Thailand. And good afternoon to our audience on the east coast of Australia. Welcome to the Australian Wheat Quality Webinar, Post-Harvest Update. First of all, my name is Larissa Kater. I'm the Wheat Quality Technical Markets Manager with the Australian Export Grains and Innovation Centre, or AGIC for short. Today, I'll be one of your presenters and I'll also MC today's proceedings. We have about 2 hours together today, and first of all, I'm very pleased to see many familiar names in the audience. So throughout last year, AGIC offered a range of different webinars to your market, from post-harvest update to specific webinars on baking quality and noodle quality using Australian wheat, milling efficiency, whole grain products and others. This year, as you see, we are starting again with a virtual or webinar presentation, but I'm looking forward to seeing most of you in market very soon, as we are planning to re-engage some of our travel and planning to visit your market later this year as well. For now, however, we are pleased to be here with you online once again. Before we start with official webinar proceedings, just a couple of little housekeeping remarks, which hopefully will help us all best enjoy today's proceedings. So today's webinar is simultaneously translated, and you can choose whether to listen to us in English or in Thai by using a little globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom platform. So you can choose between English and Thai. Throughout the proceedings, please use the Q&A tab to type any questions or any comments you might have as we present. We have about 15 or 20 minutes time at the end of our last presentation today, and we'll do our best to address all of your questions and or comments that you might have. I'm sure we are all very familiar by now with Zoom platforms. However, if you do experience any issues of technical IT nature, please use the chat tab. Let us know what the issue is, and our IT support in the background should be able to help you out. Also, at the end of the webinar, we are going to be conducting a very brief, very quick exit poll questions, few questions on our performance today. So we ask you please to participate. Let us know how we went, as we do use your feedback to continue to improve our performance. So again, welcome to the Australian Wheat Quality Webinar, post-harvest update from our growers to our valued customers. Today's webinar is again kindly supported by Austrad and also Grain Growers Limited. And I'd like to acknowledge in particular Grain Growers Limited and their support, as one of our presenters today is supported by GGL. First of all, in terms of program today, we've got Mr. Rod Baker from Australian Crop Forecasters, who opened the proceedings today with his presentation on our production and supply. We'll follow by my presentation on the quality of our most recent harvest, and finish off with a presentation from one of our farmers, Mr. Nigel Cornish, who will give you an overview of a typical grain production in Australia. So for now, first of all, I'll introduce briefly Rod Baker, who will be, as I said, our first presenter today. So Rod has worked in the Australian agricultural industry for the last 25 years across many different sectors, including roles in farm management and specializing in horticulture specifically. Most recently, Rod has been in wholesale fruit and veg as well as grain marketing. Today, Rod joins us with the Australian Crop Forecasters as an agricultural analyst. And for the last 30 years, the Australian Crop Forecasters have been the leading independent crop information service in Australia. Their clients include a range of trading companies, end users, so flour milling companies like yourselves, storage, bulk handling companies, banks, insurance agencies, and many others. So Rod is here today to give us an overview of our production and supply throughout 22-23 harvest. Rod, welcome again. Screen is all yours.
Lovely. Thank you, Larissa. Okay, good morning everyone in Thailand. My name is Rod Baker and it's a great pleasure to be presenting the views of Australian crop forecasters on our supply and demand situation in Australia. So firstly, I'll give you a bit of an overview of the growing conditions that we experienced during 2022-23. And during my presentation and Larissa's, you'll hear a lot about the quality of the crop, low proteins and that. So hopefully I can paint a bit of a picture of the growing season, the conditions we had and why we ended up with some of these this quality profile that we'll be talking about. So as you can see, we had a very, very wet season. So these two maps, the one on the left is comparing the previous season, which up until then, 2021-22 was the largest crop we'd ever produced in Australia. Then on the right is the map showing growing season rainfall from March through to October. And as you can see, a lot wetter than the previous season, especially on the east coast through Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. So the blue is representing above average rainfall. So the darker the blue, the more rainfall. White is average and red is below average. And as you can see, pretty well every growing season had above average rainfall or very much above average rainfall. It's just starting with sowing conditions. So sowing begins around about April, May through to June. At this time, Australia had a strong start with opening rainfall topping up soil moisture conserved in subsoil from late 2021. And this allowed a full plant to happen. Good establishment, the crop got off to a very good start in most regions. Then just a bit of an overview of the growing season rainfall and conditions. So we had rainfall following that La Nina pattern, very much above average. So similar to what we had in 21-22. The only difference was rainfall continued right through to spring across Australia. The rains caused severe flooding on the east coast, especially in New South Wales. So leading into September, October, soils were already full moisture profiles. New South Wales received around about 240 millimetres of rain during this September-October period. This caused widespread flooding. We estimate around about 300 to 500,000 hectares of land was abandoned, majority in central New South Wales. This not only included wheat, but barley, canola, chickpeas and several other crops. It's hard to quantify the exact amount, but there's a lot lost. This rainfall also stopped growers from being able to top dress nitrogen. So a lot chose to apply fungicides when they got a chance to get into the fields. So a lot of the rain also, when that nitrogen was applied, was leached out. So this has sort of led on to the reasons why we had a lower protein crop this year. Just a quick look at WA and Western Australia and South Australia. Both had a more conservative start to the break in the season, but still above average. Western Australia saw a solid winter rainfall over the June and July period, receiving about 100 mils over that period. This rainfall really set them up for a strong finish and what ended up being a record crop. South Australia had a little bit less rainfall over that period, but it was very timely. A couple of pressure points during the season, but they got through it and they ended up having a record crop also. Heading into spring conditions and harvest, pretty well presented a perfect finish across the country. No major heat, wind or frost events that can destroy crops in the later stages. This is quite unusual. At least you get a few regions across the country that will have a frost event or a heat wave go through and take that yield potential out of the crop. But this year was pretty much a textbook finish to the season, which allowed a record harvest to come in. And so this graph here is showing Australian wheat production by state. As you can see, we've had the last 3 previous seasons have been consecutive record crops, which is unprecedented in Australia, and very, very much above average. This year, so we've got a stacked bar chart showing each state's performance. Every state except New South Wales had record production. So New South Wales production ended up being down around about 31% to the previous season's record crop due to the flooding and crop losses. But this must be noted that they still came in well above the 5-year average. So these consecutive record crops have had a large influence on the quality profile of the crop. High yields and low protein, a common theme across Australia. So we've just got a comparison year on year of the estimated wheat grade splits here. As to the quality of wheat produced, we have seen mixed results, but quality has come in generally better than what was anticipated prior to harvest. Record yields in Western Australia and South Australia have led to grain yield dilution. As a result, we can see ASW, which is in the green here, making up 46% of this season's crop compared to 31% last year. And well above the 5-year average of 27%. We saw a big drop year on year in the amount of GP, general purpose and feed grades in purple here. So this year we saw 7%, an estimated 7% compared to 20% last year. This is due to New South Wales last year had large rain events through November and December, which downgraded a large proportion of their crop to feed grade due to sprouting and falling numbers. So New South Wales, they did receive above average rainfall this year in November, but the crop was a bit later, so they missed out on having those large downgrades. The crop wasn't quite mature enough. So although a smaller proportion of the crop is made up of high protein APH and AH specs, the record production sees overall tonnes produced in line with the 5-year average. Noodle wheat just up here came in around about in line with last year, just a fraction down. So this graph here just gives us a look at estimated wheat grade splits by tonnes. And the takeaway from this graph is that APH and AH combined high protein was in line with last season with about 5.8 million tonnes produced. APW was the highest since 2016 at around about 9 million tonnes produced. It was ASW that was the big mover, the Australian crop falling off the so-called protein cliff this season. ASW production estimated at a record 17.5 million tonnes versus a previous record of 14 million tonnes set in 2016-17. And also another big mover was general purpose and feed grades. which came in well below what the market was expecting. So we have very high production and good quality. Let's have a look at how exports are tracking. So here we have bulk exports. We have this season in the grey. We have last season in the yellow, which I'll just note, last season Australia exported their largest wheat program ever at around about 27.5 million tonnes. And then we have the 5-year average in blue. As you can see, wheat exports are tracking well above average. So they got off to a strong start in October, November due to our large carryout. And then that's continued right through to December, January, February. We have had updated data come in since I've prepared these slides, and that record pace has continued through to March, and looks like it's going to drop back in line with last season in April, and we're expecting it to drop down in the following months, which I'll explain more in the next slide why we think that. This is just showing accumulated exports, and as you can see, running very much above last year and well above the 5-year average. So at the moment, we're estimating around about 27.2 million tonnes of wheat will be exported this year. So just down on last year's 27. Oh, sorry, I had no video on. Just down on last year's 27.5 million tonnes. I'll just note that this is bulk export. I haven't included container exports, which on average account for another 2 million tonnes. So one of the biggest limitations to reaching or surpassing last year's record comes down to export capacity, and also wheat is facing competition from record barley crops and canola crops that also have to be exported. And also we're expecting New South Wales exports to decline 20% year on year due to less production, and that will have an effect on the overall export number this year. So just looking at where the wheat is going. So China is coming to number 1 position this year. Once again, their exports is currently sitting at around about 4.1 million tonnes. We've upgraded our estimate. We think there's going to be about 7 million tonnes exported to China this year. But I'll focus more on Thailand exports. So Thailand exports are currently sitting at around about 530,000 tonnes. And we see another 110,000 tonnes on the forward stem up to date. At this stage, we're expecting 800,000 to 1 million tonnes to be exported to Thailand this year. Last year was 828,000 tonnes exported, and the 5-year average is 600,000 tonnes. So we're sitting above that at the moment. Just in general, you see we've had some strong export into Africa early on in the season and the Middle East. We've seen that drop off in the recent months with exports coming out of the Black Sea region, but particularly Russia. So another reason why we expect not to surpass last year's record wheat crops. This just shows last year's exports to the same period. So yeah, Thailand's sitting in 7th place at the moment. Last year at the same time they were 9th. So exports a bit faster than last year into Thailand. Just wanted to highlight the ending stocks situation in Australia. So this is showing ending stocks for wheat in the yellow, barley in the blue, and canola in the purple. As you can see, those 3 record crops in the previous seasons have seen ending stocks increase each year, and that's for each commodity. Just a quick overview of the Australian domestic feed grain surplus and deficit. So domestic grain use in Australia is mainly on the East Coast, Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. And this is showing, despite 3 years of record production, the East Coast has not been able to build up a significant surplus of grain due to differing reasons. We saw a slight positive surplus this season. So if we get a dry season this coming season, we'll see a drought premium work back into prices on the East Coast, and increased basis work back into price to keep the grain in that domestic market. Just a quick look at our S&D demand. So this is our balance sheet. We have carry-in production, interstate transfers and imports making up supply, and then domestic use and exports making up demand. Wheat carry-out will increase 44% year on year. So we're seeing it jump from 4.3 million tonnes last year to around about 6.2 million tonnes this year. However, the balance sheet is seen tightening on the East Coast. Combined Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria carry-out will be down around about 50% year on year. But WA is where the stocks are building. So year on year, after 2 record growing seasons, we see WA ending stocks more than doubling to 4.4 million tonnes. That'll have an effect on exports. You know, we'll see strong exports out of WA right through to the start of next harvest if they try and get rid of that crop. And now just a quick look at the global supply and demand. We can see 2022-23 season world wheat production in yellow and compared to domestic consumption in blue, and the world wheat ending stocks in grey here. So we have high global production being met with strong demand. As such, we'll see stocks to use ratio lower than a year ago, and global ending stocks are lowest in 5 years. So still a fairly tight balance sheet at the moment globally. Just to look at the world wheat production in the major exporting countries and new exports. So these tables are showing USDA wheat production and export estimates in the top 5 exporting nations. And we've also included Argentina in this mix because they're a large competitor for Australian wheat into the Asian region also. So in the production table, we can see that the reduced production in the Ukraine and Argentina is around about 21.25 million tonnes. And then on the export side, we're seeing exports forecast 14.8 million tonnes less than last year. So once again, Australia is well placed to pick up these extra exports that's going to be reduced from these 2 countries. And once again, we'll see Australian exports around about last year's pace of 27 million tonnes. Now, just a quick look at pricing. So we've seen these are Russian 12.5 FOB prices compared to WA APW FOB prices. As you can see, we've had a lot of Black Sea Russian wheat come onto the market since the start of the year, pushing prices down. WA has followed along, but they still are, they're back trading at the long-term average spread of around about $40 to $50 per tonne, higher than Russian wheat. So yeah, these prices have sort of been more demand based. Can expect pricing to start looking at the supply side, looking at new crop Australia, new crop Northern Hemisphere. So any sort of supply shocks, production shocks could see prices push back up again. And last word here, latest indications of Western Australian APW have been around about $302 US per tonne free on board. and indications of Western Australian ASW around about 290 free on board at the moment. That was earlier on in the week. So that pretty much sums up the supply and demand outlook for 2022-23. We'll just have a quick look at 23-24. So what does it hold in store? At the moment, the strong consensus that La Nina has ended, with a shift to El Nino later in the year strongly possible. We have had a dry summer, but we've had a widespread rainfall over the end of March into April, which has lifted confidence for the upcoming season. And as such, we've seen some regions have started planting this year's crop, mainly canola and some dual purpose crops. We'll see wheat probably start in the next week, the next couple of weeks into May and June. But at the start, the March and April rainfall has improved the outlook, the planting outlook. Area planted for wheat in 23-24 is expected to decrease unless there is a very favourable autumn break. So we'll be looking for a bit more rain in the coming weeks. But at the moment, there's been some good opening rains. Assumed development dry conditions expected to see wheat production fall to 28 million tonnes. However, we have some good stored soil moisture from last year, which will benefit winter crops if they get established. And this should see Australian wheat production remain above average. However, it's still very early days and a lot can happen between now and next harvest. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Rod, again. An excellent overview of our production and likely demand throughout the coming year. So thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
For all of you in the audience, please use the Q&A tab of the Zoom platform. Type your questions now for Rod or later on during the proceedings. And as I said, we'll allocate, or we have allocated 15 to 20 minutes at the end of our official presentations today, and we'll do our best to attend all your questions and or comments as best as we can. Thanks, Rod, again. For now, we'll move on with the program and our second presentation of today, which I'll deliver for you. So we'll have a look into the quality aspects of wheat in our current harvest. And before I start going into the quality, I'll very briefly touch with you on how we at AGIC here create value for our customers and also our industry collaborators here in Australia. I'll very briefly go over some of the market signals and drivers as we see them developing and signals and drivers that we use here at AGIC to make our decisions on investment. But most of our time today will be on the quality aspects of our 22-23 harvest season. So starting with our operating model, if you like, or value creation, most of the time our technical teams, and this is certainly true for most of my team, we operate in market, working closely with our first and second stage processors, so flour millers like yourselves, bakeries, noodle makers, cake, cookie makers in our export markets. Going forward, increasingly, a lot of our focus is going to be on consumer behavior and consumer preferences in most of our export markets. And this is really in order to best understand what it really is that drives our decision making. So as consumers see every day, as we go into our supermarkets, to buy food for our lunches or dinners or our families, we make certain decisions, either noodles versus bread products, or cakes versus cookies, or certain type or brand of noodle product versus another. So understanding what really influences us as consumers is increasingly going to be very important for us, and one of our key projects with some of our export markets. On the right-hand side of your screen, storage and bulk handling companies here in Australia, grain marketing and trading companies, our producers, pre-breeding companies. AGIC, we don't really actively participate in any of the activities, so we don't breed new varieties, and we certainly don't grow, sell or export anything. But we've got a very close collaboration with everyone in our supply chain, and particularly, for example, with our breeding companies, number of different collaborative projects we have with our key breeding companies in order to support them developing better varieties for our customers. So in a way, we spend a lot of our time in market with our customers, gathering information on quality of our wheat, quality requirements going forward, understanding how our wheat is being processed, and what typically customers use our wheat for. So we use that information to support our not just breeding companies, but other research organizations in Australia to support our industry develop best possible products for your markets and for your customers, more importantly. At the same time, like what we're doing today, we share our insights and knowledge from our industry, anything from development of new varieties to seasonal quality of our crop with you to support you as best as we can in your decision making. So in a way, if you like, most of our activities can be summarized in three segments: technical support, and so again, this is largely what my team does. We spend most of our time on doing the best we can to support all users of our grain, either with knowledge and information, or in perhaps seasons like we are experiencing right now, help you extract the best possible value you can from our grain. Market insight, again, together with our marketing team, we spend a lot of time with our customers identifying not necessarily what your quality requirements are just now and today, but very important for us in our industry is to be able to understand how those preferences and requirements are changing between now and particularly over the next 5, 10 or 15 years in order to inform our breeding and pre-breeding companies in particular and position and best cater for your future quality requirements. Innovation, of course, as our name says, our researchers and scientists dedicate a lot of their time on developing either new products and or new processes, which again, it's linked to giving you best possible support we can to extract greater value from our grain, either through new products and or different processing techniques. I'll move on and very briefly touch on some key signals and or drivers as we see them developing in our export region, but also here in Australia. So it applies equally both for us domestically here in our export regions. What we do observe, generally speaking, it's increase in population. Also, more importantly, greater number of people being employed, and specifically more and more or greater number of women being employed, which immediately suggests a greater demand for so-called convenience style products. So products that are easier or faster to prepare for our meals on an everyday basis. Also across in Australia and in our export region, relatively speaking, greater income, which also suggests the more income, disposable income we have available, the more likely we are as consumers again to be spending some of that income at least on luxury products perhaps. And so it's very important for us here to really understand both direct and indirect requirements of our grain industry, so direct and indirect grain consumption, if you like. Direct, of course, again, we're talking here about our first and second stage processes and our consumers. Again, what it is that drives your decision in which type of wheat to purchase, and more importantly, or as important, how are our consumers in our supermarkets every day behaving, if you like, or what it is that drives their decision making, for example, between white noodles or yellow noodles or whole grain products. With greater income and luxury products also in most markets comes together, it's typically increased consumption of meat. So in order to support the demand for meat products, we have to understand what type of meat, which markets, and what type of grain is ideally required to support that demand. Also, coming back to luxury products, perhaps in many markets, those might be alcoholic beverages, as you can see on the screen here, beer. And so what is the quality requirement for best beer making, for example, but also in many other markets beyond alcoholic beverages, particularly nowadays, many other beverages are made using different types of grain. And so again, understanding what type of grain and specifically what quality is critical and important to meet this particular market segment. So both direct and indirect grain requirements of our grain industry, very important for us to understand how to strategically best position with our industry to support your needs and your requirements. In Australia here, we do forecast to increase to about 30 million people by, roughly speaking, 2030. So that for us, it's approximately an increase of about 5 million. We also anticipate that about 3/4 of the 5 million will find home on the east side of our country. So what does that mean for our grain production and export? First of all, with increased population, particularly on the east side of our country, that means that our domestic requirements of our grain producers will be greater. So there'll be a greater demand by our own domestic industry on our grain producers, both for milling purposes, for example, in terms of wheat, but also feed purposes. So again, related to meat and animal production. So that also means that a greater demand will be on our exports to be coming out of South and Western Australia as well going forward. Of course, exports will continue out of our east coast, but it's going to be a greater pressure on the east coast production by our own domestic industry going forward. Okay, so let's now move ahead and look at some quality aspects of our most recent wheat harvest season. And before we go into quality details, just a quick snapshot on a 6-year average now. So a chart here covering data from 2017 to 2022 and wheat imports by volume by our markets. So as you can see here, and most of you in the audience in Thailand, I believe, do know that Indonesia now for quite some time has been our single biggest wheat importer. In fact, together with our domestic milling market, Indonesia is our top user of our wheat. Interesting here on the chart, as you can see, it's position number 2 and 3. And so this really is in line with our 3 now consecutive large productions. So China and Philippines in particular have been significant buyers of our wheat in the last 2 or 3 years, as our productions have been hitting record targets. Most importantly, perhaps from the chart here, it's to realize that top 7 destinations of our wheat over the last 5 or 6 years have been in our immediate Southeast Asian or Asian region in particular. And we expect that to continue over the coming years for sure. Okay, so in terms of quality now, by now you've realized, and Rod has mentioned it a few times in his presentation, we have had just another record harvest. And so typically what that means is as the yields increase and as our production increases as a result of favorable amount of rain that we received throughout the growing season, some of our protein, of course, it's diluted with an increased yield. So a typical correlation between wheat yield and wheat protein content. So the greater the yield, the lower the protein content, and vice versa. So on the chart here, we have a summary of the last 4 seasons. Dark blue bars here, 1920 season, from left to right, followed by yellow bars, 2021 season, the green bars, 21-22, and the most recent 22-23 harvest season in light blue bars. And also from left to right, our 4 main hard grain milling types of wheat, APH, AH, APW, and ASW. And also from your left-hand side to the right-hand side, different production regions. So starting in Queensland, New South Wales, followed by WA, Western Australia, SA, South Australia, and SE stands for Southeastern Australia. So as you can see, the larger typically production, as we've experienced in recent, particularly two or three seasons, slightly lower protein content or a slight decline in protein content in our grades. Very important, and this particularly applies to our most recent season. Of course, it's also to understand and observe the impact of rain on falling numbers, but also, of course, starch pasting properties of our wheat. With falling numbers, very important here for you, again, it's to realize that in addition to our quality management at the variety development stage, we also, of course, have a very strict quality management in any given season at the receivals. So particularly with falling numbers at the receivals, we apply for our milling grades and classes minimum falling number of 300 seconds, suggesting internationally recognized minimum cutoff for sound wheat. So we are talking here about sound wheat, so falling numbers above 300 seconds. But if you look at the absolute numbers, absolute falling numbers in our drier seasons, so again, more on the left-hand side here of your chart, and absolute falling numbers in more wetter seasons, if you like, i.e. more rain. The absolute numbers in wetter seasons, of course, are slightly lower. So sound wheat, but slightly lower falling numbers compared to dry seasons, suggesting higher levels than normal of enzyme activity in our grades and classes. So we'll move on and have a bit more detailed look on the quality in our eastern states. So particularly important for some or most of you in Thailand, as most of your container export does come from our eastern states. So again, we'll start with a couple of charts here on the slide on the left-hand side at the top, the wheat protein. So this is now looking just around 22-23 harvest season, and the bottom chart is the viscosity. So this is now beyond the falling numbers, looking actually at flour paste viscosity And looking again here at our hard milling grades, so the dark blue bars, APH, light blue bars, AH, Australian hard, and the yellow greenish bars, APW. And just the names here at the bottom for you of different production regions. Doesn't cover entire production, of course, but just a number of samples we've been able to obtain to cover some key, perhaps, and cover the eastern states, if you like. So again, large harvest means good tons are available and good quantities are available for exports. However, with larger harvests, as I said, the inverse relationships comes into account with our protein content and slightly lower protein content. Within the grades, so APH1 or APH2 or AH1 or AH2, again, remember our receival, GTA receival quality standards come into place. So we do have minimum protein requirements for each of our grades. So within the grade, we're still meeting, of course, your minimum receival standards for our AH1, for example, or APH1 or 2, but overall, a slight decline in terms of protein content. Particularly important for all our customers, particularly if you're thinking of noodle making, is to monitor your flour paste viscosity. And apart from a slight decline in protein content, another quality trait that we have to monitor closely, particularly when it comes to high rainfall like we've experienced here in Australia, particularly in the eastern states throughout last year, is viscosity of the flour. And as you can see, yes, there are some regions where we've got some better results than in others. Mackay here, reasonably okay, but in many other regions, largely due again to high amounts of rain and in some cases flooding as experienced by some of our farmers. Falling numbers as such still sound well above 300 seconds, but I suspect slightly elevated enzymic activities than usual has resulted in overall decline in viscosity. So in terms of rheological properties, on the slide here, a couple of typical tests that we all use in order to understand how strong are our mixing properties, perhaps how stable or how extensible our dough is. So on the left-hand side at the top, farinograph development and stability time. At the bottom, extensograph extensibility time, so how extensible are our proteins in our flour. And on the right-hand side at the top, extensograph Rmax here, an indicator of strength, if you like, as most of you in the audience, of course, will be familiar with. So generally speaking, again, less stable, weaker dough rheological properties, so less stability, less strength across most of our milling grades and classes. Extensibility very much in line with the protein content, and again that's as expected, as most of the time what we typically see is relatively speaking good correlation between protein content and extensibility in our wheat, but a slightly less stability and less strength in our rheological properties or protein or gluten properties, if you like. I'll now move across and look at more specifically our WA or Western Australian and South Australian production as well in terms of quality. We'll start in Western Australia first, and we'll start with protein content again. So a busy slide, I appreciate that, quite a few bars here, but again, a summary for you of four seasons, ranging from 1920 to the most recent on the right-hand side here. Specifically, again, here in WA, and again, in line with our national crop profile or picture, if you like, the bigger the harvest, a slightly lower protein content. I'd like to draw your attention particularly here to the right-hand side of the chart and the area here highlighted in red. So one of our industry initiatives here was in order to support most of our customers and create a little bit more value, particularly at that lower protein content end with our grades. The industry here in Western Australia segregated our lowest protein content hard milling grade, ASW, at two different, if you like, protein contents two different protein contents. So we've introduced here in WA ASW9, indicating ASW type of wheat at minimum 9% protein content, which basically means in WA, your good old traditional ASW1, it's anything that's below 9% protein content. So value creation, particularly for those customers seeking a little bit more protein content at that ASW type. In terms of, again, falling numbers here in WA, again, remember this is talking again at receivable standards are in place, GTA receivable standards minimum cutoff for falling numbers for sound wheat, for milling grades, it's 300 seconds. But again, particularly in WA, if we look at our more dry or less rain seasons and absolute falling numbers, falling number values, and compare those to more rainy seasons, the absolute falling numbers are slightly lower. So if you like a decline, a trend of a decline, but remember well above 300 or above 300 seconds, so indicating sound wheat, or certainly wheat meeting the receivable standards. Coming back to South Australia and looking at the wheat protein profile in South Australia. So again, a summary of 4 different seasons for you here. A range of different production, as you can see on the chart here, so different regions within South Australia, and again in line with, roughly speaking, in line with the national production. So in seasons where we had greater production, that protein is slightly lower, and again that typical relationship or correlation between yield that we achieve with our wheat and protein content that our plants achieve. Falling numbers, again, very similar, same trend to what I've just discussed for WA and nationally as well. Sound wheat meeting GTA quality, receivable standards, but overall a bit of a decline in trend with absolute numbers in dry seasons compared to wet seasons. So this is, again, particularly important to monitor in line with our starch-based viscosity for processing, but specifically then application, noodle applications. Very important, of course, always, but perhaps a little bit more important in seasons like we've just had, it's to go beyond grain and look at some flour quality as well to gain a better understanding of functionality and potential end-use applications. So I'll start in Western Australia first. We come back to our perhaps most commonly used rheological tests to understand how extensible or how strong are our rheological properties, particularly speaking protein in our gluten, in our flour. So again, we're looking here at WA, we're looking at extensibility and strength in our flour, in our most recent 22-23 season, and looking at the 4 main production regions or port zones, if you like, in WA here. So with extensibility, top chart here, typical relationship again between protein and extensibility. This is what we often see. The higher the protein, the greater extensibility, and vice versa. So almost, if you like, a textbook relationship or correlation here. Not so much with max or an indicator here of flour strength, much greater seasonal impact on our RMX and strength than on extensibility. And as you can see here, almost inverse relationship between what you would otherwise expect to see as our stronger grades, for example, AH in some regions, and strength. So generally speaking, lesser strength than normal within our grades in WA this season. In terms of viscosity again, so on top of falling numbers that I've just talked about a couple of slides ago, flower paste viscosity here again, the current season and the WA for production zones. As you can see, historically speaking, this is a little bit below our historical average or averages, or to some extent quite below our historical averages, but a little bit better, in some cases much better, higher, greater viscosity than to what we've seen in our eastern states. And this is basically a result of different seasonal, largely different seasonal conditions, i.e. amount of rain and particularly floods we've had in our eastern states versus here in Western Australia. So in South Australia, coming back to our rheology, extensibility and strength in our flower and in our extensibility and strength of our proteins, if you like. So again, with extensibility, pretty much fairly same or similar trend to what I've just discussed for Western Australian production. And again, typical relationship between protein content and extensibility. And pretty much similar for most production regions in South Australia to what I've just said for WA in terms of strength or RMX. Much greater impact, seasonal impact on the strength in most, again, production regions in South Australia. And generally speaking, on average, lesser stability and lesser strength in any given of our grades. So extensibility is still quite good, but less strength than we would typically expect to see in our AH or APW specifically. In terms of viscosity in South Australia, as you can see, slightly a decline, particularly in some regions. If you look at the middle portion here, so our AH, APW from a couple of different regions in South Australia, slightly less viscosity than in Western Australia, still particularly in some regions, so at the left here and the right-hand side of the chart, certainly much better to what we've seen in most of our eastern states. Historically, quite a bit of a decline again, and again, largely a result of a very, very wet season or a year we had here in Australia last year. So in terms of end products, very briefly, and I'll touch on a couple of main products, and we'll start with baking here. So a fairly common baking test we utilize here to best understand potential of our flour. So this is not a test that is going to give you a straightforward correlation on how our wheat and flour might behave in your bakeries, but a very lean formulation we use here in a long fermentation baking test to understand potential, if you like, of our wheat and flour to be used for different baking processes and or in different baking grists for a range of different baked good products. So a summary here of bread volume and a potential to achieve bread volume across different Western Australian and South Australian environments for two AH blue bars and green yellow bars, our APW. So as you can see here, again, generally speaking, on average, slightly better volumes in South Australia, certainly a little bit better volumes than what one would expect from our rheology alone. but and also in line, so better volumes here in South Australia compared to Western Australia are in line with our historical observations. So we do typically see slightly better or stronger, if you like, baking performance in South Australia compared to Western Australia. That typically is related to protein content, but also stronger rheological properties as well. In terms of noodle quality, again, just one example here that we use to understand functionality potential. So we are using here fresh style yellow alkaline noodles and looking at different aspects of quality, both sensory and objectively analyzing our color and eating quality of our noodles in order to understand, again, how our wheat and flour might perform in different noodle processing and application styles. So I'll start here with a summary of noodle color and color stability data. So results here are objective measurements of noodle color as measured by an instrument called Minolta chromometer. I'm sure all of our colleagues in the audience are very familiar with a test measuring color of our noodles initially as soon as we make noodles, remeasuring the color on our products after a certain period of time. So in our case here, that's 24 hours of color stability. And then the results here are a summary of the change in color. So with this particular test here, we measure on the left-hand side, the top chart, change in noodle brightness. The bottom of the left-hand side, the change in the darkening of noodles, so Minolta B, initially measuring the yellowness of noodles, and then over time, how dark our noodles are becoming over a period of time. And on the right-hand side, change in Minolta A. So Minolta A, of course, a color spectrum between red and green. Very important, and particularly if you see here Western Australian and South Australian environment, is to monitor this particular spectrum, color spectrum change. And so the greater the bars, the more change. So in this particular test, we want lower bars, as lower bars indicate lesser change, so better overall appearance of our noodle products. So as you can see, if you look at the combination of change with brightness, and particularly here the change in redness to greenness, we see less change in Western Australian environment compared to South Australian environment. And so again, this is in line with our historical observation, slightly better noodle appearance or noodle color in our WA environment compared to our South Australian environment. Particularly with brightness, that is somewhat related to protein content, because we know that the higher the protein content, slightly less brightness in our noodles. So again, fits expected results and roughly fits with our longer term historical averages. Quite important, of course, apart from appearance, so how good our noodles are looking, it's to understand the texture, how good our noodles are or are going to be for our customers and consumers. So here again, one fairly simple test using an objective test or texture analyzer to measure, in our instance here, initial noodle firmness, and then also conducting a second texture test after we purposely overcook our noodles to better understand how good or how stable or how resistant in particular is our gluten and starch matrix to overcooking. So as you can see, again, WA and SA environment, much firmer initial bite, particularly for our South Australian production region. And so again, we all know and understand and have observed this many times before. This initial firmer bite is very well related and correlated to protein content. Protein content is not the only contributor, but it's the largest contributor to this initial firmness. Very important, however, is to observe what I call here tolerance to overcooking, so the light blue bars, and relatively speaking, fairly good and almost same stability, if you like, or tolerance to overcooking, both in Western Australia and South Australian environment across most of our grades. So that's quite important to understand the stability of our network of gluten and starch, but perhaps particularly more important, strength of our protein and gluten network in our noodles. So overall, in terms of our end products, noodle texture, firmness, as we've just seen, typical relationship or typical firmness between our classes and grades. Chewiness, we expect it's a quality trait we usually measure and assess by sensory, slightly less compared to our historical averages, and this, I believe, it's largely due to a lower viscosity. Noodle color, brightness, as I've said, largely related or correlated well with protein content in our grades, and as I discussed, lesser change in WA crop compared to South Australian crop. Baking, however, particularly volume aspect, as one of the main quality traits when it comes to baking, slightly higher, i.e. better in South Australian grades compared to WA grades, but within the grades or between the grades themselves, the typical relationship between or expected result, I guess, between AH and APW performance in our test baking long fermentation test. Overall, in a summary, our 22-23 harvest, as you know by now very well, we've had another third in a row record harvest, and that has resulted overall in a lower protein content. The large harvest is a result of a lot of rain that we've received, as nationally speaking, in last year throughout the production season, and so particularly in some parts of our country that has resulted in lower viscosity, lower starch-based viscosity. In terms of grades, lower protein content means most of our grades by production is of ASW quality. So about, as you've seen from Rod's presentation, almost half of our production nationally was of ASW quality, followed by APW, followed by AH, followed by APH. In terms of absolute tons, because of our record harvest, about 38 million tons we harvested nationally last year. In terms of absolute tons and amounts, still good quantity of AH and reasonable quantities of APH available as well, or within our five-year average, basically. Very important to understand, particularly this year, the value of our GTA receivable standards, making sure that only sound wheat is segregated into our milling grades, making sure that we meet our minimum protein requirements for our grades, as well as other quality traits like moisture content and impurities, particularly important for our flour millers, of course. We expect quite a few challenges this year in terms of technical troubleshooting on how best to use our wheat, how best to blend our wheat this year, how to extract greater value of our lower protein wheat this year compared to last seasons. More than happy to support you, of course, as best as we can. Our technical team here at AGIC, together, of course, with the rest of our industry, is well positioned to respond to our seasonal challenges, and we look forward to working with you throughout this shipping season, and certainly do the best we can to support you, maximizing the value of our wheat in your production and satisfying, most importantly, satisfying your customers and our consumers in your market. For now, thank you for your attention again, and I'll park the 22-23 harvest quality aside for just a little while. Remember again, if you do have any questions or any comments, we have allocated time at the end of our last presentation today. We will be doing our best to attend to most of your questions and comments at the end of our last presentation. For now, again, remember, use the Q&A tab, type your questions, type your comments, let us know. Any feedback is more than welcome, and we use that to improve, of course, our performance. For now on, we'll move ahead with the last presentation for today. Unfortunately, our third presenter is not able to join us live. Our farmer Nigel is pretty busy getting ready for the coming season once again, but we have he's kindly recorded his presentation and will play his presentation for you very shortly. But I very briefly will introduce Nigel to you. So Nigel Cornish is a fourth generation family farmer from Queensland, so northeast part of Australia. And on his farm, he grows many different crops, from wheat to barley to chickpeas, sorghum, cotton. And in his presentation, he'll outline for you his decision-making around crop rotation and how he goes about his family farm. Nigel is also a very active industry participant. He is currently a deputy chair for Grain Growers Limited and also a spokesperson for sustainability at Grain Growers. He was awarded at 2013, Young Australian Farmer of the Year. So no one better than Nigel to give you an overview, connect our customers a little bit closer with our producers, and to give you an overview of perhaps a typical farming business from our East Coast. So we'll play his recording now for you. A little technical hiccup. Will play Nigel's recorded presentation very shortly. Just bear with us for a couple of seconds, please.
Thank you very much, Larissa. It's a great opportunity as a wheat grower in Australia to be presenting to you in Malaysia this morning. I'd like to thank AGIC and Grain Growers for inviting me to speak to you this morning. So as mentioned, my presentation will go for about 15 to 20 minutes, and I'll be talking about my production system in Queensland, where I'm from, and also going to the production and quality of the wheat during this last season. So this is my family farming business. As Larissa mentioned, I'm a fourth generation farmer in Australia now, and the family's been producing wheat for over 100 years now. This is where my farm is located at a place called Condamine on the Western Darling Downs. It's about 4 hours from Brisbane. We've got both irrigation and dryland cropping. So we've got 450 hectares of irrigation, and about 4,500 hectares of dryland cultivation. And each year we try and produce around 2,000 hectares of wheat per year. So it is a family farming business. On the left is my father and I in the wheat last November, just before it was about to start harvest. And on the right-hand side, they're my two sons, Will and Henry, who will hopefully be the 5th generation farmers in our family. And as you can also see, we also grow barley, chickpeas, sorghum, and cotton in a strict farming rotation program. This is mainly to control such things as disease in the soil. So we're making sure that our soils are always suitable to grow the next crop. So our rotation system goes over a 5-year period. And in that time, we'll grow one crop and then rotate through to the next crop. For wheat, we grow chickpeas before the wheat is planted the season before, and this increases the nitrogen in the soil and allows us to produce high protein wheat. So this is the climate on the Western Darling Downs. As you can see, the average rainfall was 550 millimetres per year. Last year, we received a record 1 metre of rainfall, so very unseasonal for us. But this led to fantastic yields on our farm, which I'll show you in a minute. And you can see the graph on the right-hand side is that we've had about 800 millimetres in the last 6 or 12 months. And with our soil type, which is a heavy, dark clay soil, it allows us to store moisture for the next crop. And at the moment, we've got excellent moisture in our soils, and we've actually had about 50 mils of rain in the last 2 weeks. And this has allowed us to set up really well for our planting season, which will kick off at the end of April. So it's not too far away at all. So this is a yield and protein history of our farm over the last 5 years or so. The yield is very much correlated with the rainfall we've had, including the drought years of 2018 through to 2020. We had, in 2019, we only had 150 millimetres of rain for the year. So in comparison of last year, where we had over a metre of rainfall, it is, certainly chalk and cheese of how quickly it can change in Australia from a rainfall perspective. And the yield from last season was our best on record. So we nearly averaged 6 tonne per hectare from our wheat, which is an outstanding result for us. And we do try and produce very high protein wheat, and it is very much correlated with the yield that we produce. So with lower yields, we expect high protein crops. And as you can see, in 2020, we averaged 15% protein for wheat, which is all Australian Prime Hard 1. This year was very interesting. You can see we had a protein of 11.25%, and we did fertilise our crops adequately to produce high protein wheat. But unfortunately, the amount of rainfall we had, the nitrogen in particular leached through the soil. So we had to apply more nitrogen to increase our protein levels. And Larissa and Rod did an excellent presentation before to show this. So this is our wheat planting. We normally plant in May and June. Last year in particular, it was very wet at planting time. We could only start planting till June because the soils were so wet we couldn't get onto the paddocks. And we actually had to drop out about 500 hectares of wheat because it was just too wet to get onto the paddocks. We fertilise and apply fertiliser pre-planting and at planting, but also in crop to try and get the highest quality we can, or highest quality and yield we can off the farm. The planting rate is 40 kilos per hectare, and we're trying to achieve yields of around 3 to 4 tonne per hectare. But as you can see, last year we managed to increase this dramatically. We're on a 3 metre controlled traffic system. So this means we stick all our tractors run on the same traffic line, so we're reducing compaction across the paddock. All our machinery and tractors run on GPS, so they maintain straight lines through the paddock. And we also run a minimum till or zero till farming system, so our crops are only tilled once every 5 years or so. And this is our wheat harvest. It kicks off in November. And last year was quite interesting with all the wet weather. We actually had 200 millimetres of rain the first week we started harvesting, which was disappointing. And Marissa certainly made comments in her presentation around falling numbers. And unfortunately, it affected about 15% of our harvest, which was below that magic 300 line. So that grade of wheat only went ASW, unfortunately. The rest of the wheat was good, either making APW or AH, which was a fantastic result for us. And we sold about half of our production at harvest time, and we've kept half of our production on farm to sell at a later date. So we produced about 8,000 tonne of wheat on farm this season. 4,000 tonne was sold into the bulk handler depots, straight directly off the header into town, and 4,000 tonne is being kept on farm in storage. So we use silos, sheds and bunkers to store our grain on farm. So this is where our wheat is delivered to. So as a grower, we sell our wheat to the bulk handlers. This year we sold to GrainCorp, Cargill, Viterra, who are the main buyers of wheat in our part of the world. The grain gets delivered to our local depots, and on the screen, that is my local depot here. So it costs me about $20 per tonne to get trucks delivered to 2 miles, which is my local depot. Then it costs another $40 to rail it down to Brisbane before it is exported overseas. And just on the costings of the grain, I guess the whole of society has seen increase in costs, inflation, etc. And it did cost us about 30% extra to grow the crops this year, particularly with the cost of fertiliser and herbicides that have increased dramatically over the last 12 months or so with the invasion of Ukraine. And that's also affected the transport costs as well. We've seen trucking increases in particular increase around that 20 to 30% as well to transport grain to the appropriate destinations. So this is what we use to deliver our wheat into the local depots. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to see, but I will explain it to you. So the main one is moisture, protein, screenings, falling numbers, any foreign material, etc. That we all, as farmers, we need to make sure that we're meeting the appropriate standards to deliver against our contracts or deliver against our warehouse, which is good. So it's quite difficult because the results has already been achieved, particularly when it comes to protein. Moisture we can handle. at harvest time through delayed harvesting or using dryers. Screenings can be improved by improving the header and combine setup to reduce the screenings. But again, if we've had a dry year, particularly that spring weather, the grain doesn't feel very well, and we can have a number of small grains that will cause high screenings as well. So it's very important for us to collect data on farm. We've been collecting data for many years now, probably for the last 20 years or so. So collecting data really makes sure that you're improving and benchmarks you against previous years, but also other farmers around you. We collect a lot of data, including yield, fuel use information, fertilizer use, and spray information. And we've been able to use this data to start calculating our emissions breakdown, which government and also our buyers are asking for when we are selling their grain to them. So this carbon calculator tool shows the different crops I grow on farm, including wheat, barley, pulses, sorghum, and cotton. And sorry, it's a little bit hard to see, but it shows that the total emissions from each crop are down the bottom here, and wheat is not too bad, and cotton's quite high. So, and then most importantly is that carbon emissions intensity at the bottom, and wheat is very low, which is good for us. The pie graph on the right-hand side shows where the emissions are coming from on farm, and you can see the fertilizer use and the scope 3 emissions, or the pre-farm gate emissions, are our highest emissions on farm. So it's important for farmers in this day and age to increase our sustainable practices and making sure that we deliver good outcomes to our buyers of grain. So one of these practices is the introduction of a weeded camera sprayer, which identifies individual weeds across the paddock and allows us to spray. The camera sprayer is using about 90% less chemical than we normally would through a conventional sprayer, which is great for the environment, but also reduces our chemical costs dramatically. So through Grain Growers, I mentioned before that I'm Deputy Chair of Grain Growers, and I also lead the sustainability framework for growers across Australia. And we've been developing a industry framework to make sure that our growers in particular are always improving and delivering good outcomes for our industry, but also for our buyers and our consumers. So the framework is split into 3 themes: responsible stewardship, building capacity and wellbeing, and consumer confidence. The 3 themes are broken down to allow growers to focus on these areas and to improve practices on farms. This could be workplace health and safety, making sure that we're looking after our employees better, making sure that our regional communities where we farm and live in are thriving, and also making sure that we meet our goals and targets around buyers as well. So making sure that we don't have any chemical residues, etc., in our product before it is sold onto our buyers. It is important for farmers to be telling our story. I've been fortunate enough to be involved in 2 documentary series on television the last 3 months around sustainability, and it's amazing the interest the broader public has got around the technology and research, and the farming practices we are using to keep improving and become more sustainable. And this is Ben Taylor, one of my neighbours at Condamine. He's standing in front of a crop of chickpeas. And as I mentioned before, we use these chickpeas in our rotation to improve our nitrogen in the soil, but it's also a disease break in our cropping rotation. This is Jason talking to the TV presenter around our rotations, and here we are planting sorghum for the summer crop. And here I am talking to another presenter and just about the different farming practices we are doing on farm, and they're blown away of what farmers in Australia are doing to produce high quality products. And that's me, Larissa. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box or open it up into the live question and answer. So thanks, Larissa. Thank you very much.
Thanks again. We acknowledge Nigel's busy time, and thank him for taking time to record his presentation for us today. So at this stage, I'd like to invite you, Rod, back on with your camera. Thank you. And so now it's over to you, our colleagues and friends in the audience in Thailand, to keep typing your Q&As, questions, and/or comments. And between Rod and myself, we'll do our best, as I said, to address most of your questions. So while we get started, Rod, I might pass a couple on to you.
Sure.
Starting perhaps in one of your slides, you made a couple of comments on or what we've experienced in the last particularly 2 seasons with larger crops, limited export capacity, and you spoke briefly about that likely being the case again this shipping season, largely from a bulk perspective, and or how would you see that impacting container export, particularly from a Thailand perspective?
Container exports seem to be picking up, like with better trade. There's more containers available. Prices come down a bit. So we've actually seen quite strong container export this season. So that shouldn't impact the bulk side of it, shouldn't impact the container side too much. So we're seeing container volume bounce back.
It's good.
Yep.
Thank you, Rod. Maybe another one for you, reflecting on significant, I guess, or above normal behavior and purchases from China and the Philippines last couple of years. Your views on how likely is that likely to continue, or what's your views on the next, particularly the current shipping season and or the next year?
Yeah, sure. So definitely we're still seeing strong forward demand from China. So they're currently sitting at around about just over 4 million tonnes at the moment for this season. USDA just upgraded their total imports to 12 million tonnes. So that's mainly going to be supplied from Australia and Canada and US. So we initially had China at 6 million. We're pushing that up to probably 7 million and could even go as high as 8 million tonnes this year. And Philippines is still showing strong demand also. But yeah, going into next season, it'll be dependent on what sort of crop we have and the prices. It will be dependent on the export size next year.
Sure, thanks, Rod. There's just a couple of general comments or questions rather on access to the presentations and material we all presented today. So within the next few days or about a week, we will send you links and information on how to obtain copies of today's proceedings. So yeah, the answer basically to that question is yes, we will be sending you copies of material we presented today and the recording of today's webinar. So that should be with you within a week or so. Rod, another one for you, perhaps your views on demand and or behavior, I guess, out of Africa in particular, North Africa perhaps, and likelihood of that changing with the Black Sea significantly coming back into the exports again.
Yes, sure. Yeah, we definitely, earlier in the season, we saw some strong demand or business done into Africa, container-wise and a little bit of bulk. Early on in the season, we've seen that drop off a bit now with that Black Sea exports coming out and the price becoming more competitive there. Yeah, going forward, whether we pick up a bit more later on in the year, again, will come down to the price and whether we can price back into that region. Yeah, so that'll depend on the Black Sea Corridor Agreement, what happens in the new crop coming out of there. But
Sure.
we've definitely got the grain to go there. The capacity and elevation is another issue too, I guess. And also you still get seeing strong demand from the Asian region. So that'll be the first port of call, I guess, for our grain.
Okay, thanks for that, Rod. We don't seem to have many more questions or comments from the audience. So if there's nothing further, thanks again, Rod, for your time. Thank you, everyone in Thailand. We look forward, as I said, seeing you soon in the market again. I'd like to once again acknowledge support, particularly of Grain Growers Limited, supporting Nigel's presentations across a range of our webinars and activities, and also, of course, the Austrade, which once again have supported our activities in most of our markets. So thank you once again. We look forward to seeing you soon again. Before we let you go, however, very quickly, few questions for you, perhaps to give us a bit of your feedback on our performance today. So appreciate your time, couple of seconds perhaps to give us a feedback on today's value for